Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here and listening. And I'm going to be a bit analogic because my iPad just broke. So it's going to be a notepad and a pen. We listened to two very interesting speeches approaching the problem from different perspectives. Actually, I think that the title of this panel could be as well, like, could need a comma, like, not politics meet citizens, but politics, comma, meet citizens. Because technology and social media today are instrumental in a very deep transition. We're talking about hierarchies, but more in general, the relation between citizens, voters, people, and traditional institutions in politics, and by that I mean political parties, but also public administration. Now, politics is acknowledging the actual existence of citizens, because citizens have now a way to voice their opposition to something, what they don't like about politics, about corruption, and of course it's something that you constantly hear about in the media. The very interesting factor in this transition is that institution like this institution need to change somehow, because this model it's not working anymore. But how? And more importantly, how can citizens and institution can communicate in an effective way, actually producing change? So my first question to our speakers is what's missing here? We saw in the presentation different model of e-democracy platform. We saw how political parties and groups are organizing themselves through this platform. But if you consider Occupy Wall Street, the Indignados, and other movements, you can notice that they've been very effective at disrupting the existing model, but not equally effective in building an alternative. So why is this happening? What's missing here is politics, is technology, is culture, is a mind frame. So this is my first questions to our speakers.
There's one important point, is that why in Europe anyway did Indignados grow so strong in Spain and Occupy grew strong in the UK? While in Sweden or in Germany, the Pirate Party managed to grow and managed to achieve at least some parliamentary representation. Well, I think actually the outer parliamentary movements have developed very strongly in countries where there's a very high barrier to entry in the mainstream politics. You need great strength, a very high percentage of the vote in both Spain and the UK to actually assume traditional political power. That barrier to entry is somewhat lower in certain other European countries. So that's the first. And the second is to what extent do you actually trust the mainstream, even if you're a networked organization? Do you actually trust the power of government? And I think that is another factor that explains the difference.
I don't know. That would be an honest answer. So everybody must have an opinion. First of all, there's a difference between Indignados in Italy and Indignados in Spain. There were no Indignados in Italy. But the Indignados in Spain were connected through Twitter. And when you go and look at what was going on in Twitter and you track back those tweets, you find that it wasn't really a completely flat organizations. There were some people that were speaking more and some others that were receiving more. There was a peer-reviewed paper that actually measured all this. Don't ask me the reference over here, I'm sorry. I know that you really like it, but I can't do it at this moment. In a similar way, there were analyses of indignados in other countries. And there was an analysis saying that if the indignados go, there is a sort of revolution, and everybody have like the same T-shirt, the same material. We had, in Italy, we had, come si chiamavano quelli, tutti vestiti di viola? Il popolo viola. So, in a situation like this, it isn't really grassroots. There have to be some sort of organization. And so the suspect that behind some of those movements, there was someone trying to really move what was going on, and it really, they didn't need to move it in Italy. Maybe Beppe Grillo was already doing it enough, or the Pirate Party was already doing it up. That might be actually an alternative explanation. Apart from this, if you want a new organization to arrive, you need two things. You need a good platform, and I'm sorry, the liquid feedback is not a good platform. And you need, at least at the beginning, a charismatic leader who is able later to make the incredible act of generosity to step back. And we don't have the first, we don't have the second either. So at the moment, I'm working on making the platform. And you know, maybe you can become that kind of charismatic leader.
Thank you, but I rather doubt it. But the person who's closest is probably Rick Falkfinger, who founded the Swedish Pirates. So.
Oh, okay. Takes a little bit of time. Another thing I was I was fascinated by all the description of experiments, voting theory, but I couldn't help thinking that we're talking about answers. We're talking about people voting, people writing proposal of some sort, but since we have like way to do legislation in the parliament and stuff, we're still talking about questions. We're still talking about answers. We're not talking about questions. So in a platform, we're thinking about a movement platform. But if we wanna actually be part of the decision, shouldn't we think who's asking the questions? For example, I'm thinking if right now somebody asked us, do you want to abolish this tax or this other tax? Lots of people will probably agree because nobody likes taxes, especially some of them. But if you get to think that this tax, if it was abolished, it would lead to pay more money in city taxes. Like you take off a national tax, and then you have to pay more on city taxes. The decision might change, but the people who are asking the questions, maybe they're not that interested in giving a different perspective. They kind of not giving all the information. So I think that's kind of an issue here to address, together with scalability. And you mentioned that, but for example, we're talking about experiments in a handful of people, not the many. But if you wanna have an impact and have more people willing to participate, then how do you handle scalability? So questions is primarily for you, but of course, John, weigh in whenever you want.
Let's keep scalability on the side. The position of who is going to write the question is extremely important. And how do you actually write the question? I mentioned that I have my own experiment that's called Wilfredo Goes to Athens. And in Wilfredo Goes to Athens, it only works for some questions. And the question has to be open questions. So if you're asking, should we take away this law, that's not an open question, because the answer is normally yes or no. Not only you want an open question, and in e-democracy we are moving toward the open question. I mean, to just ask which of those two options are we going to do, if it's very easy, there's no issue over there. I mean, the Swedish the Swedish DemoX party has been handling that from a long time ago. The problem is, can we have open questions where people are actually presenting their ideas? And in doing this, it's important, you are correct, how you write those questions. They have to be written in a neutral way, because people, when writing their proposal, they will be answering the question, but they will also be posing the piece of legislation, a direction for the legislation, for the legislators later on. So that's absolutely correct as a problem. What we actually ended up doing in Wilfredo Goes to Athens, for very important questions, not for all the one, but for the important one, was to ask a meta question. How should we ask this question? Now that's an open question. So you answer that question and you get the question that you're going to ask. And then you pose that question. Now, if you ask, how should we ask this question? You can still play the game and say, oh, but even here I can pose it in different ways. There's a level of trust and, you know, at some point you just mentioned, we are speaking about abortion. How should we ask how to make a law about abortion? You know, a general term. And then it will come out a neutral way, and then the neutral way will actually be answered.
Just a very quick example back on your point about taxes. There was the case of the participatory budgetary example in Porto Alegre in Brazil, which managed to achieve 10% maximum participation in the society about working out how to allocate the city budget. Now, while that's not great participation in comparison to an election, what it nevertheless allowed them to do was basically say, well, you had the opportunity to participate, now you can essentially complain less, because when you had the opportunity to participate, you didn't take that. So it gave that additional security to the politicians, if you like, in order to manage to try to push through those reforms. And you touch upon an issue which is maybe was behind the scenes of what I said, which is, while we might be able to run campaigns about fishing or about water or about protection of bees or whatever, 101 other small issues, how, as a politician, do you weigh up, should I allocate a certain amount of money to research about bee populations or fish populations or water safety? In the end, representative democracy has to try to solve the balance between those different topics. So we're becoming very good at using networks online to apply pressure to particular pressure points in our political system. But that doesn't help the politician themselves work out, should we deal with bees today or fish tomorrow?
But then, we're working on decisions, on single decision, but then in this new model, in this new kind of relations, who is in charge of long-term thinking? Who is in charge of having a vision? Because the average citizen probably doesn't have a clue of like a budget, how to allocate money on a sector or the other. You made important, I don't know, healthcare. Somebody can care more about education. But like just in general, the average citizen doesn't know how this works and how to allocate a big amount of money. And there are some policies, I'm thinking about development policies, for example, but not only that, they take time, take years to be effective. So how do you ask people about this kind of thing? How do you give people information about this long-term, about this vision, about long-term thinking?
But you could ask that question the other way round, which was you could probably poll people to say, do you think politicians know how to run budgeting? And you probably find an enormous number who would say, no, we disagree with what they're doing. So you have this kind of paradox in that circumstance that while the population may say they don't really know anything, they will still complain that the politicians are taking the wrong decision. So you have to find a way and a means of bridging that gap. So you're right at one level, but if the population is still complaining about about their politicians' behavior, you've still got to manage to put that right.
Let's go back to the question about scalability. because essentially we are always dealing with the same thing. This, what you're speaking about, is the question about scalability, which is also the question about how do you handle technical problems with a non-technical audience. Now, there are two basic strategies that people have been doing, and one is direct democracy, and the other one is delegated democracy. And the idea of delegating someone at the beginning was because those people maybe had more education. That was maybe in the time in which 1% of the population could really read and write. But now it's really not the case anymore. So then there are people who are saying, oh, but we cannot let people decide on things, either because they're not technical enough or because the decision will actually go and touch their own pockets. So, for example, we don't want people to decide online about taxes because everybody would want the tax to be lowered, which to this point is always reminded me by my father every time we discuss. Now, to this point, I answer, okay, but following the same line of reasoning, politicians should not decide among how much they are going to be paid, and they actually do. So either we accept this, and then we have to have some sort of division, you know, like check and balances, where one side decide for the other, and the other side decide for the first, and both decide for the rest of society, or something like that. So that's one part of answer that has to do with people deciding on something that touches them directly. But then there is the other side, which is the technical side. How are people going to decide on things that they don't know a lot? Now, Fishkin presented a model of deliberative democracy, whereas they would take a representative sample of the population and say, okay, now you represent the whole population, we are going to ask you to decide about bees, for example. And they take them and put them in a hotel for 2 or 3 days, and they get all experts over there. You know, people about bees and people from Monsanto and people from Greenpeace, all sides. And at the end of this process, they come out with an answer. And what Fishkin used to do is find out the voting before and the voting answer, after, and see the difference, the delta, and then decide that was would give us an information about how much society would actually change if everybody would be educated. Now, this is an important point. If people have to decide, for example, about death penalty, most people in many countries would actually choose to go for that death penalty. But if you ask those people, after they've studied the issue and they spoke with people and historians and how societies changes when they have and then when they don't have, how crime changes or doesn't change, adding death penalty, the majority switches to the other side. So an educated voting is different from a non-educated voting. And this is actually a really important point, because people delegating, but they themselves not being educated, they're going to choose someone who is still going to choose for what they would do without them really knowing the issue. So what is the solution? Fishkin suggests a solution. I would like to suggest another one. The other solution is crowdsourcing. Having a platform where when one person writes a proposal, other people can say, I do not understand this proposal. And other people who understand that proposal can write about it. So it's like a common system, but a structured common system with points in for and against separated, and documents clearly separated, and questions and answer separated. So a very structured document that grows. Something like this can be done. It's not technically difficult. If there is a proposal, the question, what does this proposal mean? It's a neutral point of view, factual question that you can use a wiki to understand. We have the technology for that.
Okay, but I think the issue here is not if we have a technology like that is up to do this kind of things, but also I think the issue is people Because, for example, in the US, there's a death penalty in most of the states, and even if there are like tons of studies that show that it's not effective in like lowering the crime rates, lots of people, and even like very religious people, are very much for that penalty. And recent like tragical events also show that when there were shootings in school, that didn't change the mind of people that were advocates for like against gun control. So I think here the issue is one, like people like emotion and how people feel about a few issues. You mentioned abortion before, but also people like, I mean average people, not people normally involved in this kind of process. I'm not sure that the mind frame is having the time to listen to every aspect of every side of the issues, all the information necessary to, and even like ideas like crowdsourcing. You were talking before about delegating. You delegate badly, but people are probably like delegating badly right now when they vote for people at the parliament, even if technically our electoral law doesn't allow to pick a candidate. And another issue in what you said that I'm considering is that who is choosing the actors to discuss? Because, for example, and I'm talking about my experience working with Diritto di Sapere, which is an NGO advocating for access to information law, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act in Italy, which we don't have. Very recently, last week, or earlier this week, there was an international meeting of an organization, the Open Government Partnership, that it's an international organization of many states working with civil society to achieve transparency and open government. And they didn't invite lots of the most important actors in civil society. And when they voiced their protest, they ended up inviting them, and then they went out of the room when they started talking in their session. So this is, of course, just an example that I know by first account, but it's an issue because if let's say the government or whatever decides who are the actors that can discuss an issue, you're posing yet another barrier. Like the government. If, like, for example, the guy, the organization that is deciding who sits at the table is posing another barrier, and so, like, for citizens, it becomes more and more difficult to get around. Like, even with platform, even flattening the field.
Should I answer? So, Antonella, you're looking for the perfect picture. I mean, you're looking for, okay, how it's going to work. We don't have this. We have steps, one step after the other, and every time we kind of adapt. We see what works, what doesn't work, but we have the luck that we have many steps in many situations all around the world at different levels. We have several nations, and in each nation you have regional, you have common, you have small groups, and each of them it will be a test ground. And then things that will work will actually be copied over and over. In England they started e-petitions, and then the US picked it up, and then Europe is picking that up. So we don't have a final image, but one step at a time.
So, looking for a common language between citizens and institution, it's probably time to ask you what you think and if you have questions for our speakers. There.
Hi, I wanted to ask, how do you plan to address the problem of mass media tampering the agenda of issues to be debated? Because usually that's the problem, the main problem to address priorities, that they can bias people?
You could probably devote a whole session in the program in order to manage to deal with that. This is one which is very much on my mind as a British citizen engaged in European Union questions, which is dealing with the bias of the British media when it comes to the European Union. I think there are the cases of, again, Grillo's movement. If you looked at Jobbik in Hungary, if you looked at the rise of the Pirate Party, where actually you can build organizations kind of underneath the radar of the mainstream media. That's one way and a means of doing it. Second, I think this is also, without going too far down an alternative line, is also whatever the agenda is that you're trying to push, it's very important to make sure you can clearly state that agenda, whatever that is, rather than fighting it on the field of battle, which is already set for you by the mainstream media. So that, for example, in the things I deal with on an everyday basis, the fact that the British media hates the European Union and thinks it's a waste of money, if I go back and go, it's not a waste of money, then they've already set the frames of reference for me. I need to determine if I'm an advocate for the European Union, how do I want the European Union to look and to argue for it in that sort of a direction. So those are a few things to bear in mind, but I don't think we have time to go into a kind of ins and outs of the relationship between mainstream media and online media and media ownership and some of those sorts of matters.
I would like to add also something. If you have a blog, if not open one. But don't just blog repeating things from other people. Study an issue, become an expert about it, and blog about that issue. Become the expert about that, the person that the media will actually contact when they want to speak about that particular element. Mainstream media speaks about mainstream irrelevant elements. I find because there is not a lot of other stuff that people speak in a technical way inside. When I started blogging about e-democracy in a precise way, I got a lot of attention. Maybe not from formal media, but hey, they invited me here. So, and now I think we are actually streamed in some newspapers. If you speak with a technical knowledge about something and you have something to say, people eventually will pick it up. You have to have something to say.
I have a question. The question is concerning how is it going at the international level? Because my impression is that much of the discussion concerning the relationship between institutions and alternative ideas from the citizens are at the national level. And this is not the only level, because the national parties are attacked, I feel, from two sides. From the bottom, which is citizens, but also from the top. Because if we look at the size of powers, the international powers are much of a bigger size and have effects on, you see, for instance, the financial crisis, all the national levels. In the past, there were NGO in English. Now, how are they doing?
This is a very important point. I do think we had the great example this week, to go back to one I mentioned in passing, the reform of EU fisheries policy. And the result of the reform was actually much greener than anyone was expecting as a result of the pressure of the NGOs. A great alliance of, I've just come yesterday, I was on board a Greenpeace ship until yesterday. The alliance of WWF, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, celebrity chefs, all kinds of others, put together a tremendous alliance at European level to push for a green reform of fisheries policy. So that for me is a good case of saying those types of organizations are really active. If you make enough of a fuss, you can change things at European Union level. If you look at the protest mounted against ACTA, for example, that's another case in point. So I think you can build those networks. They are maybe negatively biased. By that I mean it's easier to criticize something or to block something, to bring something down, than it is to build up something alternative. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is the kind of political structures, if you like. Yeah? The influence of the European Union over national democracies is undoubtedly growing. There is obviously a role of other international organizations as well. Now, you've got two options. Do you want to take that thing apart, yeah, and return that democracy to make it more national, or do you try and democratize it at European Union level? I.e., do you need proper functioning representative democracy, a better functioning civil society at European Union level? And I would strongly advocate that that ought to be the solution. And those are the areas where I'm personally very active, is to try to manage to make sure that, for example, that there should be known candidates for president of the European Commission at the time of the 2014 European elections, for example. So those types of national political systems, which admittedly might be kind of cracking at the edges, nevertheless, that's still one of the better systems we've got to try to apply some of those things at European level. I'd much prefer that as a solution. Then we have to deal with the other things, which are the global institutions, which themselves have such a lack of accountability problem, UN and NATO and OECD and others. But that's how I'd advocate the thing should go. But there is a very, very active and vibrant NGO sector in Brussels, also online networks, that needs assistance from the national levels as well, and can importantly deliver good policy results.
I would just add that we don't have a platform for a national level. From a scalability point of view, I would take it easy. Just slowly. I mean, I'm always the technical side, and Jon is the political side. And from a technical side, every time you find something that works somewhere, that you spread it. And from this point of view, all this is international. Yes, there is nothing actively, directly acting at the international level yet, but, you know, things are moving. I'm just taking the time.
I saw there was a question there. Okay, there, yeah.
Good afternoon. It was pretty related to the previous question, as I wanted to ask you if you think that through e-democracy the actual power could be back to the people. Like we hear often from our politicians that they have locked their hands for changing stuff, as there are network of power that are international, that let's call it banks or lobbies around the world, that you can't really change at a national level. So therefore, I was also asking about international network for democracy, but from a technical point of view, you already answered me that, so go step by step toward that. But more importantly, if in a vision that we could have, and Antonella, I don't think actually the average politician showed to have a vision lately. So we can have the power to also to elect or find some people that can make the change. So not just the legislation, but actually do change structurally the global system.
To go back to Colin Crouch, he says that politicians want something like, forgive me if the quote is not quite right, but something like the maximum level of compliant participation is what politicians want. By that I essentially mean you want to give people a vote and allow them to express themselves, but within very defined parameters, if you're a politician. Yeah? And essentially, in the last 10 years, 20 years, you might argue, you could make the case that the market-dominated system has won. It has set what those parameters are, and within those parameters, you only have certain kind of democratic scope to express whether you want to be more lefty or more liberal or more conservative or whatever. So So I see that, the answer to that question, as more one of political and governmental structure rather than an e-democracy question as such. Now, what we have to do, I suppose, as online political advocates is to demonstrate that alternative solutions are possible and to actually push back against those boundaries somehow. You know? But I see that first and foremost as a kind of a post-democracy political structures problem rather than an online problem.
From my point of view, there's much more than e-democracy that you need for what you're speaking about. I mean, the whole movement of transparency would become, and it's really, really important in this. But then again, in politics, you have a very important principle. You find it all the way, which is the TINA principle. There is no alternative. But there is no alternative is only true as long as you are unable to think of an alternative. And if a lot of people are thinking and a lot of people are given a voice, then sometimes alternatives are found. I mean, look at the situation in Iceland, respect to Greece, respect to Cyprus, and the lack of transparency that led to the decisions, and to the fact that, you know, in Iceland they found a solution that at the beginning, I think the World Bank said that it was not viable or acceptable. Was it the World Bank? And then it actually changed their mind and said, well, actually, it's working very, very well. So those tools will permit to have a much bigger brainstorm, and the transparency will give the information for this brainstorm to work. And then the plurality of the world will make sure that somewhere some solutions are tried and some other places no. And then you can say, but over there it worked, and slowly it will. I see it as a very slow process.
So I hope we gave you enough food for thoughts, new ideas, and maybe new questions. So thank you, everybody.